this podcast, Drew Conway from Alluvium talks about his journey in creating socially responsible data science practice. So stay tuned. So welcome everyone to Future of Data podcast. Today we have with us guest Drew Conway, and this is one of the podcasts that I really aspire to do because it brings us some interesting folks talking about interesting perspective. And I've been a huge fan of Drew and his work. A brief bio, and then we'll chit chat about what I like particularly about his background. So Drew is a CEO and founder of Alluvium, is a leading expert in the application of computational methods to social and behavioral problems at large scale. Drew has been writing and speaking about role of data and the discipline of data science in the industry, government, and academics for several years. Drew has advised and consulted companies across many industries, ranging from fledgling startups to Fortune 100 companies, as well as academic institutions and government agencies at all levels. Drew started his career in counter-terrorism as a computational social scientist in the US intelligence community. With that, Drew, welcome to the podcast.
Vishal, it's great to be here. Thank you.
Beautiful. So let's start by talking about your journey. I think it's fascinating. So yeah, if you can walk us through.
Absolutely. I think, as you probably know from speaking to many data scientists, it has a sort of winding road, and certainly not one that I would recommend for others to take. But when I was starting out in my career, I knew two things. One is I had an aptitude and interest in computer science and mathematics, but in particular, thinking about how to use those tools to study human behavior and how to think about how people make choices. I was actually very much an oddball even as an undergraduate because I double majored in both computer science and political science, which is not a typical combination that you see. But it was so atypical, and I had an interest in this particular area that my senior thesis as an undergraduate was actually I forget the title, but the idea of it was I wanted to be able to study terrorism networks using peer-to-peer file sharing networks as a sort of structural base of that. All right, and so I'll be dating myself by saying this, but I went to college when things like Nutella and LimeWire and Napster were still around and kicking. And so I used data collected from those networks to try to model out what those file sharing networks look like, and then compared it to some open source data that was available on particular terrorist networks back in the early 2000s. And so as the story goes, I wrote that paper and then ended up getting invited to a conference at West Point as a senior in college. That was, I think, it was sort of ostensibly about law and technology and terrorism. And when I got there, I didn't realize this, but ultimately what I came to find out is essentially this was a recruiting event for the intelligence community. Basically everyone, there was a bunch of students from various universities and from all of the service universities, and they were being invited to present and then ultimately get recruited into this world. And so that kicked me off into what ultimately became a 4.5-year career in the Intel community. So I had a really fascinating job, particularly at the time. So I entered the workforce in the sort of mid-2000s, right as what we now consider this kind of commodity stack of big data tools, things like Hadoop and being able to do, map reduce jobs over large amounts of data. That was all pretty new, but I was able to learn and experiment with those tools in an arena where we had access to some of the most fascinating and fundamentally challenging data problems. I was in my role split between many different kinds of topics, but most of the time what I was doing was kind of building custom integrated software and sort of software enabled methodologies for supporting forward deployed special ops teams. So folks who are out in principally the Iraq and Afghanistan theaters, but we service folks who are serving worldwide, and they had simple problems to state, but challenging problems to actually execute with data. Things like, if I go into this house, will I find the person I'm looking for? If we walk down the street, is it safe? And we had a fantastically rich data set to think about those problems, but we also had real visceral feedback loops on the quality of our work. So I learned a tremendous amount I learned, the value of skepticism in all of the work that you do, and certainly the value of these tools. And so I got to the point in that career where I knew that I had sort of reached the point of needing to go back to school and fill out all the gaps that I had in my training, which were particularly porous within the kind of statistical methods, right? I'd been a computer scientist and a social scientist, and so I knew had some substantive expertise and ideas about some things, and I had some sort of technical skills with technology, but I still didn't have that core methodological focus. So ended up leaving DC and coming to New York to do a PhD at NYU, but a PhD in the social sciences. In fact, my PhD is in political science. So ultimately decided not to pursue a technical discipline, but a social science discipline, because at the core of what I was interested in was still human decision making. Right? I was really interested in how people make choices. And as I'd kind of grown up through that early part of my career and now leaving the Intel community to go to academia, I think one of the things that I was most excited about was this sort of, now there was this massive access to human decision-making data through social media and e-commerce and all of these things that we now, again, kind of take for granted as these kind of primordial data for understanding these things. I was like, oh, I can go study this stuff. So I came to New York and started doing my work. But it was also a great time to be in New York City for someone like me, because lots of things were changing. It was actually a particularly bad time for New York. It was a particularly bad time for the economy, right? This was in late 2008. So we had this financial crisis kind of collapsing around us. But I was fortunate because I had the cover of graduate school, right? So I had the safety of being in graduate school, but had the opportunity to now interact with folks in the New York City community who were either coming from a financial services or media or product background, and people who were working in then kind of nascent startup community or other larger technology companies, and all of us were kind of coming together because there was all of this change happening in the marketplace. And so kind of through opportunity and will, managed to insert myself into that community and made some wonderful friends, some deep connections, and ultimately had the opportunity to kind of build a kind of secondary career beyond the one that I was building in my work as a graduate student, thinking about data science and how this new discipline could interact as a kind of profession as well as a path of study, and then many other things from there. But that's the sort of general path for me. That's what got me to New York, and that's what got me excited about data science.
Interesting. So I think one part that I missed to sort of communicate was that you founded DataKind, and that sort of created the social activism through data science. So let's talk about your current role before we get to a bunch of these jewels in the past. So what do you do now, and what? We'll resume after a short break. This part of the podcast is brought to you by First Friday Fair, fastest AI-powered way to find your next opportunity. Check out the website firstfridayfair.tao.ai and find your next dream job. Let's get back to the podcast.
Yeah. So as you mentioned, I'm the founder and CEO of Alluvium. Alluvium is we're a technology startup based in New York City, and what we do is build machine learning tools for men and women working in complex industrial operations. What that really means at its core is, we focus on how to leverage data that assets and operators themselves are generating when they're inside a plant, when they're walking on a refinery platform, and those tools should be there to support how those men and women make decisions. The typical example I like to think of is, let's imagine that you're standing on an oil refinery platform, and your job as an industrial engineer, and you have to think about, where in this operation should I be spending my time, either inspecting, checking, or even maintaining and repairing this kind of continuous volatile set of assets. Well, you are beset on all sides by an incredible amount of information. Each one of the, pipe fixtures and gauges on that oil refinery can in and of itself be generating more data than you alone would be able to comprehend at any given moment. And you may have thousands or tens of thousands of these sensors emitting data all the time. And so we as a company have a very We have a very sort of definitive perspective on what the value of machine learning is in this context. And what we believe it is that there always exists this kind of natural tension between having to discover novelty in these complex data sets and then having to reason about what that novelty means. And so we believe that well-designed software systems that are in place to support those decision makers should be automating away a good amount of this discovery piece, because that's what a well-designed AI or a well-designed learner should do. It should be able to observe a stream or multiple streams of data, build up an internal representation or model or intuition about what all those streams, what the function of all those streams are, and then when they begin to deviate from that expectation, okay, well, when we have some piece of novelty. But the machine itself doesn't know what that means. It has no context for what that change may mean. It doesn't even know if it's actually a valid change. But the person, that human operator, that man or that woman who's the industrial engineer standing in that platform, they do know. Typically, they have at least a decade of experience, but oftentimes multiple decades of experience. And so if we can fix that tension between discovery and reasoning to the appropriate equilibrium where those interactions that an operator would have with a system that feeds them high value information is of a high quality, that means that those alerts or that information stream is often giving them valuable information, then they should be able to quickly reason about that, build take an action or learn something, and then create a positive feedback loop in the system, right? That's the thing, that if we build kind of data-driven products, there's always that feedback of, well, anytime I interact with an expert, I want to learn a little bit more about what that expert's reasoning is, so that the next time I give them information, it's even more precise and even more useful to them. And so at our core, that's how we build products. We have one flagship product in the marketplace, which we call Alluvium Primer, which I'd be happy to talk about more. And as a team, we are very much a kind of data science and software engineering at our core. That is, the vast majority of people who work at Alluvium focus on solving those kinds of problems.
Interesting. And what's your role in that in this Alluvium landscape?
So well, depending on who you ask, for better or worse, I do a lot less data science these days. My role in CEO, I think, kind of falls into three large buckets. The first one, and maybe the most obvious one, is I set the vision for the company and our products. Everything that we've built has kind of come out of this core vision around doing real-time, unsupervised learning from these heterogeneous streams of data, and how to build products to serve folks who need to learn from that. That's my number one job. My second biggest job is really on our business development side and working with our customers. Mostly because everyone else at the company is really focused on building and supporting the tools. My job is to work with our customers and go and find new customers that may be interested in leveraging our technology. And then the third piece, which I do still spend quite a bit of time on, is continuing to build out our team. We have, I think, developed a really fantastic culture as a company, and what it means to work at Alluvium, and how we interact with each other and interact and build our not just our tools but our company. And so getting to be able to recruit and actually having a really active role in that recruitment process, I think, is actually one of the proudest products that we've built as a company, is how we bring people in and how we work with each other when they get here.
Interesting. Super. So I think let's talk about data for a few minutes. I think one of the things that really pulled me into sort of almost spamming you to come to this podcast was that, hey, and thank you for being very gracious and picking it and coming on the podcast. So it is it's this idea of data kind. So if you can walk us through what data kind is and what you guys did, and then we'll go into the nitty-gritty of putting this thing together.
Sure. So what DataKind is it's a social sector organization with a relatively straightforward mission, right? We believe that the social sector, as a sort of sector of the economy, are going after the most challenging problems that humanity faces. From environmental challenges to social challenges to economic and everything in between. So within that, you have men and women who are working in those industries who, by their own work or mandate potentially of their funding situation, are producing a tremendous amount of data, right? Typically, whether it's through measurement that they're doing in the field, even through instrumentation that they're using as part of their process, they're creating all of this data, but they have one real big problem, which is they don't have access to the world's greatest data scientists. Because the world's greatest data scientists and software engineers and UI and UX developers are typically working at the best tech firms in the world, whether it's your Googles, your Facebooks, and everywhere in between. That's where those folks go, because that's the economy of our market. So DataKind exists to bridge a gap between these two communities, to first identify the top, most talented data scientists and engineers in the world, and identify the most challenging, interesting, and most importantly, I would say, technically ready social sector organizations that can articulate a problem that they want to solve data, or a product that they want to build with data, and then we can match those two groups together. And what DataKind does, they do this in many different ways. They do it either through events, which are called data dives. They do them through short-term projects, which is through their data core group, or they do direct consulting, which they have sort of an elite squad of data scientists and engineers that can directly consult with social sector groups. And the Jake Porway, who's the executive director, he really deserves, most of the credit in building the organization since it started. Today it is not just a group of us, nerds sitting in a conference room, tooling around on our laptops trying to help one or two social sector groups that we could get in contact with. It's a global organization, has chapters all over the world, and I'm proud to say continues to grow, because that bridge between the communities has gotten bigger, and there are lots of other organizations now that exist beyond DataKind that have a similar mission. And I think in some sense that's the greatest validation that the organization has had, is that there's so much room for this in the market that folks have stood up local chapters of their own kind of data science for social good work, and taken that local perspective and made it count.
Interesting. And so walk us through the initial thought of DataKind. Like what brought you to that juncture of creating this, or fixing this bridge? And then obviously I want to spend some time in digging in what it took to build that. So why don't you walk us through that initial thought, and we'll resume after a short break. This part of the podcast is brought to you by First Friday Fair, fastest AI-powered way to find your next opportunity. Check out the website firstfridayfair.tao.ai and find your next dream job. Let's get back to the podcast.
The story of DataKind is actually very much the story of sort of the New York City data community. So, as I was mentioning when I was talking about my journey, when I got to New York, I was meeting lots of different people and having an opportunity to, have coffee and go to meetups and meet all these great people, many of which now who I'm very, honored to call my friends, but are also among some of the most well-known data scientists in the world. Jake himself being one of them, but folks from the academic world, people like Chris Wiggins up at Columbia, or Mark Hansen, and people like Hillary Mason, who at the time was the chief data scientist at Bitly and is now at Cloudera with her Fast Forward Labs group. And all of us were kind of interacting with each other in the larger community. And eventually we got into this kind of monthly tradition of having a potluck brunch at the New York Times building. So one Sunday a month, a group of us would get together and just have a potluck brunch up towards the top of the New York Times building, where the research and development group had their floor, and that was actually where Jake was working at the time. And so we would typically kind of assign ourselves a topic, and 1 week or 1 month, I should say, the topic was, how would you teach a course in data science, right? The folks from academia, and I was obviously in a graduate program at the time, so I was close to the notion, if I was going to TA a class, what we think about. And we had a great group, the folks who showed up all contributed ideas to how he would teach it, and then ultimately Jake and I started having a side conversation to say, well, I think that there's this other problem that exists, which is, where do we get interesting problems
Mm.
for people to work on, right? If you wanted to
Mm.
learn about data science, how would you actually go about doing it? Because one of the hardest things about doing data science is actually finding an interesting problem and
Mm.
then going and
Mm.
answering it. And so we had this idea to say, well, maybe there's folks from the social sector who, there's likely folks in the social sector who already have these problems kind of well established. What they lack are resources and access
Mm.
to the people. Um, so we spent the next couple of weeks just um, thinking about how we could plan an event where we could get people together to do this. So DataKind as an organization actually really just started as an event, which we called a data dive. We didn't even
Mm.
really have a sense that there was going to be an organization that did it. It was sort of a
Mm.
data dive brought to you by Jake and Drew. And we used
Mm.
our networks to go source both people on the engineering and data science side and a handful of social sector organizations local to New York that would be interested in participating. And, the first data dive, we had the local chapter of the ACLU. We had folks from the UN there, and a handful of other groups, and we just sat in an office over the weekend and did this work. And I'll never forget, me and Jake kind of walked away from that just being like, wow, there's a lot to this. People really, really like this. Let's try to do this again, but let's see if we can do it in a different city. Let's see if there's an equal amount of energy outside of New York City.
Mm.
So then we began planning a data dive in San Francisco. Same exact format. Went out
Mm.
there, kicked it off, had exactly the same feeling coming out of it, that there was just all this energy. People were continuing to work and volunteering with the organizations well after the event had ended. And so I remember it was Jake and I and our third co-founder, Craig Borowski. We're actually sitting at the San Francisco airport waiting, and we just kind of looked at each other and said, "I think there's something real here. We can actually go about starting this." And that kicked the ball rolling, and we ultimately went through the process of creating a nonprofit organization, building the brand, and in some sense, the rest is history. For my part. Jake decided to leave his full-time job at the New York Times to do DataKind full-time. Craig, likewise,
Mm.
with his job. I was sort of the odd man out because I was at the point of no return in my graduate program at NYU, and I
Mm.
said, you know what, guys, I think I really want to finish this PhD. I'm not going to quit now. But I continued to be heavily involved in DataKind in those early days. Was a member of the board for the first few years of the organization. And as I said, to the credit to Jake and Craig and the rest of the team, they've built an outstanding org.
Interesting. By the way, thank you so much for walking us through that. So now let's talk about the grunt work of building something like this or scaling something like DataKind. Like, what are some of the findings or some of the thoughts that you have? We'll resume after a short break. This part of the podcast is brought to you by First Friday Fair, fastest AI powered way to find your next opportunity. Check out the website firstfridayfair.tao.ai and find your next dream job. Let's get back to the podcast.
Yeah, well, the interesting thing about DataKind is, their central challenge is one of, how do you build a process around sort of from idea to definition to product to delivery of a data science product, sort of end to end, right? Because again, if you think about the two parties that are involved, you have eager and ambitious engineers and data scientists who want to do work, come with their own tool set and ideas of how to do stuff, and then you have deep experts in a particular problem area in the social sector, and they come together and they say, okay, we're gonna do this data science project, and we're gonna do it in 3 months. Let's figure out how to do that. So the biggest challenge to start is, how do we create a kind of modular, scalable process of going from, first getting those teams together, defining what the problem is, and then beginning to build it. And if anything, I think one of the most amazing contributions that DataKind has made to the data science community is effectively training a whole bunch of data scientists that come through their program how to think about this process. Because one of the things that is somewhat orthogonal to this conversation, but is something that I think a lot about is,
Mm,
how do we build a robust professional process of data
mm,
science? I think that's a challenge that organizations big and small feel, which is how do you go from, this sort of, blue sky, or at least, low level Earth orbit kind of idea to something that is in a product. And
mm,
it doesn't exactly work in the same way that software development works, where we have a bunch of theories of management about how to go from, ticket in a Jira system to delivery of a feature or delivery of a product. With data science, things are a little more nebulous to start, and
mm,
it can be challenging to measure your progress along the way when people come with, a specific kind of academic training or a specific kind of engineering experience, or have a specific kind of bias with respect to the data that they're looking at. That bias can be expertise, or that bias can be ignorance. And so all of those things go together. And so DataKind has developed this process of kind of building teams, tracking progress, doing check-ins, and ultimately having a set of measurements that they can use to actually be able to show the organization that they worked with, here's how things will improve, and here's what we can do. And I actually think that's one of their maybe their least thought of but biggest contributions to the folks that they work with.
interesting. And what about sort of creating awareness? Like, what are some of the best practices that you think that helped you or DataKind to create awareness? Like, what are some
Yeah.
of the hacks you can share?
So one hack I would say is get Jake Porway to start the organization for you. Jake is a tremendously telegenic and energetic guy, and so he can get out there and he can tell a story about what the organization is doing, and speak to audiences, from the C-suite on down to young kids at schools who are thinking about what they want to do in college. So that's one, but that's not maybe the most helpful one.
Mm,
I think beyond that is the strategy that DataKind put forward is one of kind of decoupling the organization itself with the mission and where it could exist in the world, right? And
mm,
so rather than having a kind of top-down approach to doing this work, one of the things that I know Jake and the team and we thought about on the board in the early days is, the things that are unique about DataKind are the idea of connecting these communities and how to organize and how to build best practices around it. But the thing that none of us in New York will ever understand is, what's important to a data science community and a social sector
mm,
community in Southern India
mm,
versus a data science and social sector community in Chicago. That local perspective actually gives you a lot more just inside information around what that community needs and how they can leverage data. And so the chapters program that DataKind kind of put forward a few years ago really allowed for the brand and the mission of DataKind to be separate from the local folks building that community and
mm,
implementing it. And so I think that was really and being able to identify leaders within that community who wanted
mm,
to step up and actually take a role in building that community. Because as I'm sure wherever you go in the world, you will find that there is big and small communities of leaders who are looking to build out their kind of data science community.
mm.
And so what we were able to do is kind of recognize where in the world were some really strong anchors for that, and then try to build DataKind chapters there. Because volunteer, it's easy to work on a project remotely, but if you actually feel the impact of that project in your own community, you're much more likely to
Mm.
want to contribute.
Interesting. I think thank you so much for walking us through that. That's really really helpful. And I think one thing that we see a lot, and we have someone with Analytics Club, somewhat similar story on sort of figuring out that New York is totally different from Minnesota, is totally different from Tuscaloosa.
Mm-hmm.
Like they all have their own local flavor, and then how can you sort of replicate a culture that's local to that particular? And one of the interesting parallel that I want to discuss with you is big enterprises building up a data science practice. Like initially there was a hoopla around, hey, it's a data scientist. Then they're realizing now it's a data science they have
Mm-hmm.
to fix. That means there needs to be people involved. There needs to be sharing involved, collaboration involved with all that. So one of the many times I told these guys, I say, look at these phenomena like data kinds or say analytics club or whatever, like these frameworks in which they were able to scale somewhat in some more cultures and sort of getting the local flavor out
Hmm.
in common contributing. So, what's your thoughts about if I'm an enterprise of X size and plus or mid to large size enterprise, and I'm trying to build a sustainable data science practice? What are some of the thoughts that you could, drawing the parallel from data kind experience and your journey so far, that you could suggest these folks?
Yeah. So the easiest place to start is to first ask yourself, you're an executive at an organization and you say, okay, I want to build a data science practice. The first thing to do is get all your product managers in the room and say, have them make a case for why data science as a discipline is actually necessary for that
Mm,
product to grow or for that business to grow. Because the one thing that I've seen consistent across the board from startups to Fortune 500 companies is that, you know, because data science, I would say even now continues to have a fair amount of buzziness around it, people have a
mm,
knee-jerk reaction and say,
mm,
okay, this is something that I can bring into the organization, and then voila, we have a sort of magical transformation of competency. Unfortunately, that
mm,
if a company actually doesn't need data science to be successful or build a product, then that will just be a failure of resource allocation and will taint the
mm,
organization for many years potentially beyond that, where they may actually have had success building something. So there's lots of examples of where you can bring technology to bear on a company, even a company, say that is a relatively old business, like in New York City. The one that always comes to
mm,
mind is the real estate business, right? New York City,
mm,
most competitive real estate market, and one of the most competitive real estate markets in the US. And so there's lots of technology companies around who want to build products that will kind of make that more data driven. But just as an example, and this is just a hypothetical, but let's imagine that you want to build a product that's going to make it easier for someone in New York to find the right real estate that they're looking for. That could be a data science project, but
mm,
probably what it really is just a data engineering project. How do I make this
mm,
data set
mm,
more searchable? How do I make it more amenable to a person wanting to look for something? So that's one place to start. So that's sort of like the big first bucket is like, do I actually think I want to do data science in my organization? Um, and then once you've gotten past that question, the next question is, what kind of data science and data scientists and organization do I want to build? Um, a good friend of mine, who's actually one of the head data scientists at Slack, a guy named Josh Wills, has this great metaphor,
mm,
which is, are you a lab data scientist or are you a mechanic data scientist? Right.
mm,
And the sort of break between these two, which I find to be really, really helpful, is that, are you doing research and development at the
mm,
kind of edge of what your organization's needs to do, or is the thing that you're building kind of fundamental to how the business makes money, right?
mm,
Are you contributing to how the product actually develops and ultimately grows the business? Because those are very different, and the way that you would build those teams are very different, and the expectations of their contribution would be really different. The problems that I often see is that organizations who need a mechanical data scientist will be
mm,
seduced by the academic credentials and the idea of these kind of big pie in the sky problem solves that they see out in the marketplace data science could solve, and they kind of do it exactly backwards, right? So if you're a lab data scientist and you're working on large long-term R&D projects, well, that means that the organization up front has made a commitment to potentially losing money for
mm,
experimentation, right? It's called research and development, and research often fails, right? The
mm,
reality is, vast majority of organizations are not constituted well to do this, right? There's Lockheed Martin and Google and maybe a handful of other companies in the world that can really say, yes, we can spend millions and millions of dollars a year on experimental software and
mm,
research and development projects, because that's what distinguishes us in the marketplace,
mm,
and that's what allows us to attract some of the world's leading scholars to come work on this stuff. Um, the much more companies need to look for this kind of mechanical data scientist. And so
mm,
what that means to me is you have to have a really good idea about how bounded the problem is that your company is trying to solve with data, right? So I'll take Alluvium as the example, right? We our fundamental unit of analysis as a business is a time series data set, right? So it's a value with a timestamp associated with it. Everything else beyond that is metadata, and we can build a system that analyzes it. But we are not looking for someone with deep, natural language processing expertise. We are not looking for someone with deep, experience building recommender systems. Right? That's just not the thing that we're looking for. We're looking for folks who have experience with time series data, but more importantly, kind of think about problems with time as a big dimension within that analysis. And so oftentimes, when I see companies writing, let's say, a job spec for a data scientist, they focus a lot on the academic credentials. You need to have a PhD or equivalent in computer science, blah, 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 which, by the way, I wouldn't qualify for. And then they spend a lot of time talking about, what data science is, or how it fits in the organization. But they don't actually talk about, like, what is the problem that someone wants to solve? What tools will they be using? How will they be expected to contribute to the business? And so, last thing I'll say on this, and want to answer any questions, but it's, when I'm talking to younger, kind of earlier career folks who are, either making the transition from academia to industry or want to jump in and start as a junior data scientist, I always tell folks, ask the company that's hiring you, what is the thing that you want me to do in my, say, first week or 2 weeks? What do you want me to know? Because oftentimes when you start a new job, particularly in kind of technical role, that first few weeks is really just, okay, here's how this company does its work. Here's the tools that I'm expected to use. And if you hear back from them and it sounds like tools that you either know already or are interested in learning, then that's a good fit. But then the next question should be, okay, what is like the first big project that you want me to contribute to? What is the thing that you think you want me to build? And if the company can't answer that question in a fairly succinct way, well, then that's a red flag to me, because it means, have they actually thought about why they want to hire you beyond the fact that they want to be able to tell people they have a data science team? That's often a red flag. But also, is what you're building contributing to the part of the business that makes money? Because if it's not contributing to the part of the business that makes money, you always run the risk of having a negative experience as a data scientist, because the thing that you're building can ultimately be looked at as, oh, that's an interesting toy, or that's useful blog post for marketing, but that's not actually contributing to the business. And I've seen a lot of data scientists who are extremely smart actually end up getting let go from groups, not because they weren't good at what they did, but because ultimately the business decided, what, we don't need this kind of data scientist. So probably a longer answer than you're looking for, but it's something we certainly think a lot about.
Interesting. No, I think that's a extremely valid point. And I think so. In our conversation, we talk to like a lot of businesses, and we see two very common problem where the data science is failing. So I think, and you put it the best in the data kind of example, that so one bucket is the problem bucket. So it has a problem the data science could solve. The other is the talent bucket. These are data scientists that could solve probably anything. So many times you see either businesses who over recruit a data science and then trying to say, now I have people, now try to look for the problem. And in some cases they say, hey, I have like amazing business problem that I'm struggling with. Now let me find talent to solve that problem. In both the cases, we see sort of this struggle of either getting the talent or getting the business compliance on. Sort of, I have folks, they're sitting idle. How can they be busy? So now drawing the parallel from data kind, like what if I need to hire that particular first person, and if I am that first person trying to build up a data science practice within this company, what are some of the things of 1 to 3 tactical steps that you could suggest to me that I could do to sort of merge these two worlds together somehow?
So I think, honestly, I think a big part of it starts with how a company builds its recruitment process, right? So I think, as I think I mentioned before, one of the things that I'm most proud of at Alluvium, but I think one of the things that I've focused a lot on in this more recent part of my career, where I've spent more time managing people and teams and less time contributing as a data scientist, is thinking about that recruitment process as a product in and of itself. And I'm happy to go into more detail here, but I think at a top level, one of the things that I think is really broken with how data scientists get recruited is most of the recruitment process focus on kind of technical minutia and coding exercises or whiteboarding exercises, and really searching an infinite space for what someone doesn't know versus trying to search a bounded space of here's how we actually do work at this company, here's what the problems look like, and let's try to see how you would work through this problem as an individual. So we often, what we talk about is, there's always asymmetry in an interview process. If I'm interviewing you to work at my company, I already know as much as there is to know about what it's like to work at Alluvium, and you might know just a tiny little bit. And the entire exercise of us kind of bringing you through an interview is one in which you're giving us a bunch of information, and we're trying to use our kind of heuristic to say, oh, well, that fit into how we work here. And to me, that's such a lossy process. Is why don't you actually have a person kind of go through the work that they would do if they were actually going to do this job at Alluvium? And so we take this approach really from beginning to end. And in some sense, we may be an extreme version of this, where right from the initial conversation to an offer, every step of the way, we want to be able to match you to how that job is doing. The interview process, I think, is maybe the most important place to start. And so figuring out how to build a process in which that asymmetry that I mentioned between the interviewer and you is reduced as much as possible. Right? There's always going to be an asymmetry where the company is going to know more, and obviously there's a power dynamic there. But how we feel is, if a person walks away from an interview with us and they say, I really have a good idea of what it would be like to work at this company, what I would be doing, then that has been a very successful interview for us. Because what that means is, if we as an organization decide that we want this person to work with us, then it should be very easy for us to get to a way forward, right? If that person walks away and says, I really know what I would be doing there, and I think I want to do it, and we give them an offer, then we can move forward really quickly. And then also, when they get to work, we know, okay, you're ready to contribute at a high level. We've already had this conversation. Versus the other way, which is, well, I think you know how to, specify normal distribution at the whiteboard, and you can do this, linked list evaluation in a coding exercise. But okay, here's actually the work that you're going to do, and now let's figure out if you like it. That I think is really problematic, and so we've really focused a lot on that at Alluvium. And I have to say, it's certainly not without its faults, and we've worked really hard to evolve and maintain a high level of quality there, and has required some changing. But I think if an organization isn't kind of continually trying to do that, they're missing on a big opportunity.
Interesting. And thank you so much for walking us through that. I think another parallel that I find really fascinating, and I want your perspective on, is so there's another perspective in building a team. So there is a business problem there, and there are people who could solve it, and then there's a data in the data science space that enabling at least if there's no data, then both of the things are moot pretty much, right? So many businesses who successfully either employ a good problem stack, or they employ a good problem talent pool, they struggle with sort of getting the data and getting the compliance, because there's a whole another ginormous behemoth called IT, and then they have to deal with IT to sort of get this data, and some data is dirty, some whatever, right?
Yep.
Things happen. So what's your perspective on what are some of the hacks that all these three could be streamlined together? And you give a very good perspective on how to get a talent pool and bringing all the product managers together to talk about the business problems. Now let's talk like how you can get data. Like, what are some of the best practices that you see?
I feel a lot of empathy for this. Certainly in my own career, having started in the U.S. national security world, where arguably is the largest bureaucratic organization on planet Earth, and so I certainly have a lot of experience there. And then more recently, with some of the other things that I've done, I think the best metaphor that I can think of, it was actually one that was explained to me as a young PhD student thinking about writing a dissertation. I remember one of my professors in one of our seminars, he went to the whiteboard and he drew, as big as he could, he drew a circle around the whiteboard. And he said, this is the universe of all the problems that you could think about, addressing in the social sciences. And then he said, and then he took a very, very thin marker and he just put a little dot in the middle, somewhere in the middle of that circle. And then he filled in about a centimeter around it. And he said, if you can write a dissertation on this dot and then build a career around this circle, you'd be a very successful academic.
Wow.
And so I think, the way that metaphor applies in business is that you will always be up against the challenge of whether it's a large IT organization or it's internal legal structures. People, it's much easier for people to say no to you than to say yes. And so what you want to do is you want to start really, really small. And if anything, you want to leverage any known problems that already exist in the organization, like articulated problems that exist in the organization that you think data may be able to solve for. And actually, one of my favorite examples of this is from local government. So this is not a DataKind project, but it was when I was working as an advisor to the mayor's office here in the city for their data analytics group. And Mike Flowers, who was the first chief data analytics officer, I think understood this in a very intuitive way, because he was a lawyer and because he wasn't really a technologist. But what he really understood is how do you get bureaucracies to adopt change. And so he basically had two rules, right? His one rule was, find the most acute problem in an organization and see what data exists there, and never change how someone does their work, just change how effective they are at doing it. And so with those rules, what the project that really put them on the map was changing how the fire department in New York does its building inspections. Right, there was an acute problem within the fire department of having very low success rates or hit rates in terms of identifying building problems when they would go out in their inspections, right? Because if you're the building inspector for some engine house in New York City, the way that it used to be is that you showed up to work, there was a stack of papers on your desk, and that stack of papers was essentially ordered in either some random or some semi-sequential way of here's all the buildings that you should go inspect today. And so that's a budget constraint that the city has. And so there are only so many inspectors that can go out. And if you don't have any smart way of kind of allocating that resource, then your success will almost certainly be worse than it could be if you had a more deliberate way of inspecting stuff. So what Mike said is, he said, well, I know that the city of New York has a tremendous amount of data on every building, right? Obviously, the fire department has as data, but the Department of Building has data. The Department of Finance knows what buildings have liens on them and what their financial records are. The Department of Sanitation knows if they have any violations of the waste code, which can be correlated with things like overpopulation or illegal conversions. We have 311 data, which has things like noise complaints and has other unsightly kinds of complaints, which again themselves can be associated with building issues. And so what he said is, all we want to do is we want to be able to rank buildings based on the likelihood that something is going wrong there. And so if you put all that data together and literally just do a simple logistic regression, you can get a likelihood that a building will have an issue with it. And that simple idea became what is now what's called the risk-based inspection system in New York. And so, taking that kind of big circle to little one, there's an infinite circle of problems that a large metropolitan area like New York City could think about solving with data. Mike said, let's solve one little problem. And in fact, we're not going to change at all how building inspectors do their work, right? Because we'll never know everything there is to know about how to do building inspecting. All we'll do is when that building inspector shows up to work, the list of buildings that they go after is rank ordered in likelihood of their success, right? So actually taking that in mind and saying, what will make you most successful? And that's probably the third most important thing that's not on Mike's list, but that I learned is like, if you want to have success in a large organization where there may be challenges with getting data, figure out what makes your customer or your colleague more successful. in a corporate setting, like what gets them a bigger bonus, right? What makes their boss happy? In a public setting, what makes taxpayer dollars allocated more efficiently? What's going to make the mayor happy? What's going to make the chief of, the fire chief happy? If you appreciate that stuff, then you can find those little dots in the circle and find the data that's in there. And then I think you will find a willing audience to share data if they know that what you're doing is only there to help them.
Interesting. That's an interesting point. So you are suggesting that get the bosses happy, get their buy-ins. So at least you can do something. Okay.
Yeah, and I would even, I mean, it may be the bosses happy, but it's like, what makes the individual happy, right? Because we were making, or Mike and the team was making, building inspectors happy, because when they would go to buildings, they would find violations, right? It would make them look like they were, it would make them not look like, but it would make them more successful in their job, which is before they'd show up and maybe they wouldn't find anything, and so they'd walk away where the citizen would feel inconvenienced because a building inspector showed up and there was nothing wrong. The building inspector would feel like they wasted time, and the city of New York would have just spent a whole bunch of taxpayer dollars to get nothing.
Interesting. So thank you so much for your perspective on that. So now let's talk about those anxious group of data scientists who are about to lose their job, maybe in this hypothetical of there's overhiring and that they don't have a business case to sort of grapple with or solve their value on ROI on. What do you suggest to those guys or gals? What are some of the things that they could do to sort of prove their worth and value in an organization?
Yeah, and I think it comes back to, so if you've already in the position of you started to work at a company and maybe you didn't get an opportunity to ask that question around, does my work contribute directly to how this company makes money? Well, now you're there. You're finding that your data science team is kind of off in the corner doing its own thing. And you start to see, the CFO is kind of sticking his head in or her head in and saying, "Wait, what are you guys doing in here?" Get back and ask your bosses or ask product managers, what are your top 3 goals for this quarter? Like, what are the things that you want to be successful in or that need to get better this quarter? And particularly if you're working at a technology company, it is almost certainly the case that one or all 3 of those answers will have some data question at the center of it, right? If it's if it's an e-commerce site and they're worried about churn or they're worried about fulfillment, that's a data problem. And you can say, okay, well, let's figure out a project that we can do in 6 weeks, something that we can do quickly to turn around and show value. Because there is a tension of time. Oftentimes, the thing that kind of fouls people up in data science is that because if it has this kind of R&D flavor, people may be inclined to let a data scientist work for months and months and months and months, and then voila, they show this interesting insight, or they generate this report that says, oh, here's what you could have done. But it's never obvious, okay, how am I actually building a product around that? But if you start and you say, okay, what is the problem that you need solved? Okay, we want to reduce churn. Okay, let's build a 6-week project that instruments the website in a way that we can understand, why people are leaving, and then build a simple fix or make a simple recommendation to how we think we can reduce that. And if you can do that within, a 4 to 6 week time period, I think, you will start to show obvious value to a business as to how they can improve.
I think that's fabulous and definitely really, really useful. So we're almost at the tail end of the conversation, and I sort of remind that sort of I'm thinking about that we're not talking about Alluvium and IoT. So I think I would definitely want to have you over and there will be a part 2 and we'll talk about it, and because I think that's another really interesting topic that I want to talk about, and then we had a slight previous conversation and want to sort of focus on that as well. It's a very, very topic near and dear to our heart. So in your journey, let's spend a few minutes on you, and then I'll let you go. So in your journey so far, what are some of the traits that has helped you stay sane through this progression of managing these big conversations and dialogues and workflows and company like DataKind? If you can walk us through that.
Yeah. First, I appreciate you thinking that I've kept my sanity. I think not everybody would necessarily agree with that. But let's see. That's a really good question and kind of a big one. So I think there's a couple things for me personally that have been really really valuable in doing this. One of them for me really is really having kind of deep humility for what I don't know. I
Mm,
actually think that's one of the most important. I think it's an important trait for anybody, but
mm,
certainly for someone who's working with data all the time. I mentioned it
mm,
before, having a deep sense of humility around your own ignorance, and in particular having a skeptical eye towards where questions come from, where data comes from, all these kinds
mm,
of questions, um, will be really valuable guiding principles for how you do your work. And so for
mm,
me, I've tried to apply that, in my role now, in a leadership role, to think about, okay, I'm building a company. I have to build a team around it. Even at Alluvium, one of our values as a company is what we call you lead with humility. Everybody at the business
mm,
is expected to be a leader within the own context of their work. And for me, as the head of the company, I want to build a team around me that effectively complements me and everyone else,
mm,
because we have to
mm,
be able to be humble about what we don't know and find people that know things that we don't, and we can hopefully teach them things that they don't know about their business. So I've been very fortunate in that I've been successful in actually finding those people, and having a chance to work with some folks for a really long time, that share that trait, and that's really important. Um, I think the other thing for me that has been really valuable in going through this is the support of the community here in New York. I
mm,
think that New York City is a very unique place to build technology companies, but in particular build data science companies. I've said this before in other mediums. I think New York City has some of the most valuable natural resources for data
mm,
science that don't exist anywhere else, right? Whether it's the university system for generating talent, whether it's the anchor industries here that are all really data driven, again, finance, media, entertainment, all of these things, advertising, all these things that have always been data driven. And then really the geography of New York too, being all
mm,
kind of crammed in this island or these five boroughs, it allows for the development of a really really rich community that I think, I've been all over the country, I've been all over the world, and seen some wonderful communities, but none of which are the same as my hometown. And I guess if there was a third one for me, it's kind of an appetite for learning. I think
mm,
you have to always seek to learn new things, seek to try to identify, whether it's a new tool set or a new methodology or a new industry and new problems. Again, for me, I've been fortunate because my career has very much been kind of, I've been very lucky because I've kind of got to decide which kinds of problems I wanted to work on and see how data
mm.
science could be applied to those. And so, that has really helped, I think reinforced for me the value of always kind of being willing to get out there and learn from other folks.
Interesting. Well said. Let's. So one more thing we ask all of our speaker is their favorite read, and do you have a favorite read that you can share with our community?
Yeah, so one of my favorite books of all time is a book called Godel Escher Bach, The Golden Braid. Um,
Mm,
it's really a philosophy book, and the central idea of the book, and you probably can tell from the title, is
mm,
about how mathematics, art, and music are all intertwined with each other.
mm,
And I was gifted this book at a relatively young age, and I remember just consuming it. Just reading it. It's one of these books where you don't really have to read it in a linear fashion. You can kind of open to any
mm,
page, and there'll be these kind of essays on stuff. And I think either consciously or subconsciously, it really kind of steeled in my psyche the value of interdisciplinary learning. That
mm,
there's this kind of fundamental interconnectedness of human reasoning, and it can manifest itself in lots of different ways. Godel was a brilliant mathematician, Escher was an
mm,
amazing artist, and Bach was a virtuoso with music. But at the core of it were lots of the same ideas and lots of the
mm.
same skills. And so thinking about how we can take these kinds of skills and apply them in different ways really had an outside impact on me. And it's a book that I love to share with people if they've never read it.
Interesting. And thank you so much for sharing that with us. Now, as a we're almost at the end of the conversation. And Drew, again, thank you so much for with your time. Extremely candid and sharing your perspective. It's really, really useful for our viewers and listeners. So, as a parting thought, do you have any closing remark that you want to give to our listeners and viewers who are still watching and trying to understand what they should do? So, do you have anything for them?
Yeah, I think for people who are listening who, are right at the beginning of their journey, there's a couple things that I highly recommend. One of them, which is, I think, hardest for folks in the early part of their career, is get yourself out there. Like, one of the most valuable things that I did when I was starting my PhD program was to, just start kind of blogging and tweeting about what I was working on. I had no preconception that there were going to be other people in the world who cared about kind of computational approaches to social science or computational approaches to, international relations and conflict study. But what I found out is that there were actually a bunch of people, and moreover, there are a bunch of other people who were using these tools that I could learn from. So that was, as I often tell people, get yourself a GitHub account, put your work online. You will find that people will come knocking on your door, and in most cases, you'll have very positive interaction. As a kind of to kind of dovetail that, the other thing that I think is really important for folks is to actually get out and talk about what you're doing. And I know even myself, folks are introverted. They don't like to get out and give talks and be in front of meetups. But a central hack there is, if you put yourself in front of the stage, then you don't have to spend a lot of energy going around and networking. People will come to you. And that, I think, is it kind of flips the script. And so, there's some nerves that you have to get over. But if you've worked really hard on something and you put it on GitHub and you feel confident about it, go see if you can talk about it at a meetup and get some people to ask questions, because it'll help build your network and it'll help you meet new people. And for me, that was one of the most important things. And for folks in business, senior or contributing, I think, again, look at that recruiting process. How do you build your team? And then, the one question that's outstanding for me, which I'd love to hear from folks about, is, what is your theory of management within a data science organization? As I mentioned before, I think that is something that we as a discipline are going to have to figure out here over the course of the next couple of years, because data science as a role has been around long enough that you have people who are kind of in that part of their career where they're thinking about moving into a more senior role. But what does it mean to be a data science manager? Right? What does that career path look like? What are our expectations for those folks? So maybe with that, I'll say, I'm easy to get in contact with. My Twitter handle is just Drew Conway, @DrewConway, all one word. Easy to email me as well. It's just drew@drewconway.com. And so would love to hear from folks about that. And maybe I'll just leave it there.
Beautiful. Again, Drew, thank you so much with your time. And we enjoyed having you on the podcast. It was really, really nice. I was mesmerized. And I definitely, it's a topic that I want to cover. And thank you so much for being generously helping us through that. I definitely want to cover even the IoT piece and your journey as a startup entrepreneur building a data science company in IoT space. But that I'll get you for that as well. So thank you so much again, and wish you nothing but success in your journey, and love to have you back, and do good luck and in your amazing journey.
Thank you, Vishal. It was great talking with you, and I look forward to doing it again.
Awesome.
I thought I was sick of home, but actually I was homesick. Never really knew that I would have to grow up so quick. I'm so uncomfortable, don't know anybody here. Just a couple dudes that I met once, that's it. And I go into the booth feeling nervous. Got butterflies in my stomach like I'm so worthless. Is the mic on? I don't know how to work this. Inside I'm breaking down, I hope I'm not up on a